In ancient times, as far back as ancient Greece, there lived a race of people like no other. Roaming the distant edges of the known world, there was a tribe known simply as the Headless.
Ancient Roman author Pliny the Elder wrote about the Headless, describing a land filled with horned asses, elephants and bears. And even throughout the late medieval times, these creatures were said to exist across the world, but then they vanished.
From Bigfoot to the Loch Ness monster, we're used to creatures that sit on the edge of belief, debated, doubted, but never fully ruled out.
But history is full of creatures that didn't survive into the modern world. Monsters once described by our ancestors in vivid detail. Not rumours, but things they claim to have actually seen. So what happened to them?
Today, we'll explore some of the legends that came before the modern mythical creatures that we know today. I'm Ollie.
And I'm Matt. And this is What We Did Before, the podcast exploring the history of modern inventions.
Okay, Matt, so as I mentioned, we have our own modern myths that are still hotly debated. You know, you've got Loch Ness Monster, you've got Bigfoot, you can add the Chupacabra and Mothman to that list as well, if you know about Mothman. But in ancient times, it feels like the classification of like myth and legend was a little bit different because actually these legends were taken much more seriously. So these headless people then, let's explain who they are.
So these headless people are a tribe called the Blemmyes, and they were headless, but in fact they still had faces.
Yeah, they did, but not quite in the right place.
No, that's right. So their faces were actually embedded in their chests.
Oh, sounds painful.
Yes, it does. I suppose you don't get neck pain. I don't know. With eyes where you'd expect a sternum to be, and mouths just above the ribs.
Oh, it's really creepy, isn't it?
Yeah. So many of interpretations around this have been drawn on what they look like, and they're all horrifying. But for the most part, they mirror the human form pretty exactly, except for the no head thing, of course.
Yeah, the no head things is sort of a major differentiator. But the Blemmyes, they weren't a monster in the way that we might imagine one today. So they weren't like described as beasts or demons. They were actually described just as people, like a tribe of real people. The earliest mentions appear in the writings of Herodotus, which is as far back as the 5th century BCE. And he places these strange races of people at the far edges of the known world. These would have been places that his readers would likely never visit. So, you know, they couldn't disprove the fact that these Blemmyes existed either. And then later, the Roman natural philosopher Pliny the Elder, he took it a bit further. So he doesn't sort of hedge his bets and imagine that they might exist somewhere out there. He actually states very confidently that the Blemmyes do exist. And he says, as you alluded to earlier, they exist in a land populated by huge snakes, elephants, bears, horned asses, and dog-headed men, which we'll get onto in a moment. But let's stick with Blemmyes for now.
So just looking at this picture of Blemmyes, I have to say it kind of looks a bit like how I used to draw people when I was a kid. So I'm wondering if it looked like that, but I just had like a head and then arms and legs coming out of it. So I don't know, maybe there's something in there.
So Blemmyes were just some wild child's drawings gone mad.
It's possible. You
imagine if we trusted the drawings of our children all the time. There would be some very weird creatures that exist in the world if I trusted the drawings of my daughter.
Well, yeah, I mean, we could go into a whole thing about our consciousness episode on this one, but let's keep it on topic. So this land that we were talking about before with the huge snakes, elephants, bears, etc., this is a place, obviously, that feels very wild and dangerous and unfamiliar enough to sort of suspend disbelief. So it wasn't written as a myth, but as fact. Pliny wasn't telling campfire stories. his natural history was meant to catalogue the world as it truly was. Plants, animals, geography, and people, of course. So to him, the Blemmyes belonged to the same category as animals like giraffes or crocodiles. Strange, yes, but they were real.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is that this belief didn't fade quickly. So medieval map makers continued to draw the Blemmyes centuries later. If you look at world maps from the Middle Ages, especially the Hereford Mappa Mundi, you'll often find them sketched into the margins. You'll see little Blemmyes appearing, like headless men kind of staring out from their chests, kind of inhabiting the blank spaces of the world, the parts of the world that people didn't quite understand yet and hadn't been able to visit.
So could you maybe explain a little more about the Hereford Mappa Mundi?
Yeah, so this is really cool, actually. This is the largest medieval map still known to exist. It's not actually a literal interpretation of the world. It's more like a religious one. So alongside the fact that it features heaven and hell, it also showcases various mythical creatures like the Blemmyes.
Oh, nice. Okay. Well, let's sort of stop there. Let's not give too much away about it. I think this could be a whole episode in itself.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. The Mappa Mundi, the whole thing could take us well over an hour to explore. So let's revisit it. But for now, let's explore the Blemmyes in a bit more detail. So what were they said to do?
Well, they were said to live in Nubia or Ethiopia in Roman geography, and they were existing as sort of a stable population, not some anomaly. And they were treated as kind of like an ethnic group and certainly not monsters. In many medieval illustrations, the Blemmyes are shown carrying spears, swords, or shields, standing in defensive or confrontational poses. So it's quite clear that medieval thinkers imagined them as dangerous or potentially hostile.
Yeah, I can't imagine that you would see headless creatures with faces in their chests as anything other than at least mildly hostile. And apparently they could speak as well. I mean, they had mouths, I suppose it makes sense. So there are sources that imply that they spoke languages. They could even negotiate, they could threaten people, or they could communicate, and they were also capable of reason and intent. So these are all very, very human attributes, not just animalistic attributes. So this is why medieval theologians later debated whether they had souls, and if they did have souls, whether they could be converted or counted as fully human.
Right, okay. So a bit of an ethical debate there, and I'm just wondering what their voices would have sounded like with such huge faces on their chest. Would have made
because all of our voices, so the origin of our voices are from our vocal cords, so they could have like very expansive vocal cords, like reaching out across their entire rib cage.
Yeah, they would have had terrifyingly deep vocals. I would imagine that would be the most metal thing I think I would see, is one of those fronting a deathcore band.
No head. Holding the microphone to his chest and just like visceral, guttural roar coming out of his body. Yeah, I like the sound of that.
But the question is, how do you headbang with no head? These are the deep topics that we have to explore on this podcast, Ollie.
I love that all of the illustrations of Blemmyes look quite different, though.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they do. So some Blemmyes are very muscular and some are thin, basically like humans. And some look pretty human and some barely look human at all. So this inconsistency kind of tells us something important, that no one was copying a real thing. I guess they were probably doing a bit of Chinese whispers on this. They were kind of just copying each other's descriptions.
Yeah, and so if they just come from descriptions, where did all of these stories of the Blemmyes come from? Some historians think that the Blemmyes might be rooted in just exaggerated accounts of real Nubian tribes, or people seen carrying large shields with faces on, or perhaps that they had their, these people may have had their heads tucked close to their chests when they marched, for instance. Maybe that was part of their marching formation. And it gave the illusion of a face embedded in the chest for somebody watching from afar who was maybe a foreign traveler who'd never seen that before. And actually, some people think they could have been travelers who wore their hair or their clothes in unfamiliar ways. And then you mentioned Chinese whispers, over time, those sorts of different factors could certainly cause features to shift, details to blur, and then all of these different interpretations coming about. And, as with Chinese whispers, it tends to happen that these interpretations become more extreme than the last.
Yeah. So you can also take some influence, I think, from... Or you can take some explanation from other things in nature, like you probably can for things like Bigfoot, let's say. So if you look at some of the great apes, like bonobos, when they're sitting down, they sort of tuck their head down and hunch their shoulders. It sort of looks like they don't really have a head, or that they don't have a neck, and the head is just part of their body. So maybe they were describing some sort of ape.
Yeah, that's quite possible. But then how do you explain the next creature that we got to talk about? Because you might be able to say a head embedded in a chest or a face embedded in a chest is an ape, or people stooping down. But what about dog-headed people? So this is the second of the 4 beasts that we're examining today. So Matt, tell us more.
So as promised earlier, we're talking about the dog-headed people, and now these were otherwise known as the Cynocephali. As Pliny the Elder mentioned, these were said to live in similar regions to the Blemmyes. It's kind of hard to describe them otherwise. They're basically just a man with a dog's head.
Great. Thanks for that. The dog-headed people are men with dogs' heads. Thanks for that.
We can wrap up the episode there. You know everything you need to know about the dog-headed people. So just wanted to make sure everyone's on the same page.
So what are we thinking, like a Labrador head?
Not really a Labrador, more like a hunting dog. So if you imagine like a long snout, teeth, and pointed ears.
Not a Chihuahua or like something cuter.
No, I mean, if you want to see that, you can try your favorite AI, and I'm sure it would generate it for you.
Yeah, true.
But pre-AI, we had the Cynocephali, and the consistent detail in the illustrations is this: they're not really described as animals that sort of happen to walk upright. They're described as people as well, as like the Blemmyes. So they have human bodies, they have human hands, they stand in groups, and they carry and use tools. They sometimes even wear clothing. I know dogs these days sometimes wear clothing, but it's a bit different. The only difference between sort of humans and these dog people is the dog head.
Okay, so heads seems to be a really important part of creating a mythical beast, doesn't it? Headlessness or a change of heads. And before anyone listening sort of rolls their eyes, I want to make something clear. These weren't originally presented as fairy tales. So in a lot of ancient and medieval writing, they're presented in the same tone that you would use to describe a distant country, like, here's what lives over there. And the Cynocephali just happen to be one of those creatures. And as with the Blemmyes, the Cynocephali almost always live over there, somewhere at the far edge of your mental map. Yeah. In some accounts, it might have been India. In others, it's Ethiopia or North Africa or the mysterious East, which is, already a bit of a clue, isn't it? Because when different writers place the same creature in completely different places, it usually means no one's working from first-hand knowledge. They're working from a tradition or a rumor that can't be pasted or, can't be copy and pasted.
So we can't really, I guess we have to speculate a little bit here, but there's the factors that obviously not many people would actually be able to go there to check. Maybe it's also a factor that you kind of don't want people to stray into the unknown. It's like a story you tell people to say, there's some scary stuff over there, don't go there. So they're kind of like a placeholder for the unknown.
Yeah, exactly. Like this idea that the world contains people or peoples unlike us somewhere out there.
Yeah. So kind of like building this distrust of the unknown so that people sort of stick together in their own communities and things. That's how I look into this. But so these Cynocephali, what they did and what they were like, this is where it kind of gets interesting, because the Cynocephali, they're not described as mindless monsters. In many versions, they also live in communities and they hunt and defend territory, and they have leaders. Some sort of describe them as fierce, aggressive, intimidating, not to be approached, but others go the other way. So they're sometimes described as quite orderly or civilized in their own way.
Yeah, that's odd, isn't it? Because you think if someone invents dog-headed men that they'd just go full bore down the horror route.
That's right, but they don't. Not consistently, and that's kind of why they make such a good creature for what we did before. They kind of sit on this fault line between two ways of thinking, like one side being, they're beasts, and on the other, it's just they're humans, just different. And I guess, again, you can kind of look at it that, people straying a bit further and seeing other people would be like, yeah, they are just people, but different. Maybe they're trying to build this kind of feeling that, yeah, they can look like us, but they're not us. They're actually dog-headed people. So some accounts sort of say that they communicate by just barking, but it's not presented as just what we think of as dogs barking, where it's kind of just noise. It's actually presented as a language. They can convey commands and negotiate and warn each other.
Yeah, and as a result, they were subjected to the same questions as the Blemmyes, like, are they human enough to have souls? And because of this lingering question, they start to creep into Christian storytelling. There's even a tradition, it's not a universal tradition, but it does crop up in some medieval art, where Saint Christopher is depicted as Cynocephalus, so a dog-headed saint.
It's crazy, isn't it? So in some versions, a dog-headed person becomes a saint?
Yeah, it's not the mainstream depiction, but it does exist. Okay. And it's kind of revealing because it shows that for some medieval Christians, dog-headed didn't automatically mean demonic. And as far as, other descriptions go in a lot of texts, the detail is weirdly practical. So they're said to be hunters, sometimes carrying spears or bows, maybe wearing animal skins. I wonder if it's okay for them to wear dog hides as their animal, or to domesticate dogs.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's strange, isn't it? Like, yeah, if you're the pet... If a dog-based animal has a pet that's a dog, is that like slavery? I don't know.
Oh, yeah, it would be. I wonder if it would be like us wearing the hide of a Neanderthal.
Oh, God. Yeah, you don't...
It's actually quite gruesome to think about.
But then I wouldn't wear a dog hide either, so...
No. That's true. I'm not sure how many instances in archaeology of like dog hides are, to be honest. I think we domesticated them long enough ago that we didn't start skinning them to wear them as clothes.
Yeah, it's actually, you can go really far with this debate. Like the dog-headed people, would it be unethical to like domesticate dogs? Like, would you ever say you'd domesticate humans? It sounds a bit strange.
Well, we're self-domesticated, aren't we?
That's true. I suppose you domesticate your children in a way, don't you? You turn them from wild to like people who can function in society.
Mine is still in the wild phase at the moment.
I don't know if we ever left that phase, Ollie.
We didn't.
So let's go back to the dog-headed people rather than the human-headed people. So some accounts say that they live in mountainous regions, kind of like, tough mountain people shaped by a harsh environment. But some writers describe them as just sort of trading with neighboring groups, exchanging goods and giving tribute, dealing with outsiders cautiously, much like a lot of humans of this time. So when we look at medieval manuscripts, and when you see them illustrated, they often appear with the same sort of visual language as any human group on the margins. That they're armed, they're standing upright. Sometimes they're shown kind of like confronting travelers, or sometimes they're simply shown existing alongside these other monstrous races as if they're just like another nation.
Okay, but where does the idea come from in the first place? Because it's one thing to exaggerate a report or see a child's wild drawing and think that that's a real creature, but it is another thing to sort of land on this idea of dog-headed and for it to stick and for it to become a real creature in the eyes of ancient people.
That's true. I mean, it's a bit harder to explain unless there were some creatures that might look like this. I mean, obviously there's wolves and things, but they very clearly have a wolf's body. So if you've ever seen a baboon up close, especially something like a Hamadryas baboon, now these baboons have like a long dog-like muzzle. They have sharp teeth, they have a mane, and quite a human posture when it sits or stands. So imagine you're hearing about that animal secondhand from someone who's travelled, and they don't have the concept of a primate as a category. And they're not thinking evolutionary. There weren't really zoos for reference for other people. So they might describe it as like a man, but with the head of a dog. And then you can imagine how that tumbles into like, oh yeah, my mate saw a man with the head of a dog.
Yeah, it just gets blown out proportion, doesn't it? Because I think actually that's such a good point. We often forget, like, we can see pictures as easily as typing it into Google and finding them. We can go to zoos and see these animals. We think it's just a given that we know what an animal looks like. You know, as young as 2 and 3 or even younger, we're showing pictures of animals from Africa like lions, and they just become a part of our visual understanding. And it wasn't the case for our ancestors.
So the next possible explanation could be basically just cultural misunderstanding. So if travelers encounter a distant group whose language sounds kind of harsh or unfamiliar, it's not that uncommon historically for outsiders to describe it as sort of barking or yelping or even growling. That's a pattern you kind of see across history, sadly. So they bark can kind of start as an insult or a misunderstanding and ends up as literal biology in the retelling.
Yeah, kind of a grim view of how we view outsiders, but it makes sense.
Yeah, and I guess we're just a bit more educated now, but you can kind of understand with unfamiliarity, the best way to categorize things is just based on kind of the things that you know, and also there was a lot of distrust of other people because it was dangerous to trust other people. So the third possibility would be masks and ritual. So many cultures use animal masks in ceremonies, and these can include dog masks and wolf masks and jackal masks. So if a traveler saw a ritual that was using this and didn't understand what was going on and then reported back, that story can turn into like they have dog heads. And once a classical author writes that down, it gains authority. It becomes real.
Yeah, so then you get what, like a later writer copying it, you get a medieval map maker illustrating it, maybe an artist adds some teeth for a bit of drama, and then another adds armor, and you know, suddenly you don't just have a rumor, you have like, well, something which has been drawn up and imagined in the minds of people. You have a group with an identity.
Yeah, absolutely.
But Matt, so far we've been talking about creatures that lived at the edges of the land, but the next one exists somewhere even more uncertain, the open sea, which for most of human history might as well have been another planet.
So this creature doesn't stalk forests or deserts. It doesn't chase or hunt. In fact, most of the time it doesn't move at all, because the Aspidochelone isn't mistaken for an animal, it's mistaken for land.
Right. This is the mythical beast that looks like an island.
Yes. So for anyone listening that didn't catch that word, it was Aspidochelone. And
very good.
In medieval texts and bestiaries, the Aspidochelone is described as an enormous sea creature, often said to resemble a turtle or a whale. And it was so vast that sailors confused its back for solid ground. So ships would anchor beside it, crews would disembark, and fires and camps would be made. And only then would the creature reveal itself.
By sinking.
Yes, by sinking, dragging ships, supplies, and people down with it.
Yeah, that's genuinely horrifying.
Yeah, it is, especially because we both come from an island. You can imagine that could, if that happened, that's terrifying. So
yeah, imagine if Guernsey just suddenly dragged all of its inhabitants down after however many hundreds of thousands of years of its existence.
Yeah, the turtle has woken up. So, but it's not just something that we can theorize or joke about now, because what's striking about this is that it's very consistent across different sources. The Aspidochelone appears in early Christian texts like the Physiologus from the 2nd century AD, which later fed into medieval bestiaries.
You just remind me what a bestiary would have been.
So bestiary is like a compendium of real and imaginary animals, plants and rocks, kind of like what Pliny the Elder was compiling.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I'm sort of imagining it as the Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them from Harry Potter.
Yeah, basically,
that kind of thing.
Basically the real world version of this. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
So the Aspidochelone also appears in seafaring lore, which you can imagine why, based on the fact that it mostly seemed to affect sailors, or they were worried about it, and also in sermons and moral writing. Sometimes it's called the Aspidochelone, but sometimes it's just called the Great Fish. But the behavior is always the same. It waits, it deceives, and then it kills through false stability.
Yeah, which immediately to me brings me back to a point you made earlier. It kind of feels less like a monster and more like a warning.
Yeah, exactly. It's not like a creature that attacks you. It's a creature that punishes assumption or kind of like comfort in, you can imagine for seafarers, it's actually quite a useful kind of fable to say, don't necessarily just make the assumption that when you're on dry land, you're going to be safe. And this kind of tells us a lot generally about the people who told this story, because the medieval sailors did live with a constant uncertainty. They didn't have accurate charts. They didn't have weather forecasts. There was no way of really knowing whether beyond the horizon was safety or death. The sea was a really treacherous place to be.
Yeah, and what people may have been seeing was, there are some plausible explanations. It could have just been whales, for instance. So some species of whale, they rest at the surface completely still for long periods of time. And if a sailor has never seen a whale before, especially in calm water, this massive unmoving shape could easily look like maybe like a low-lying island. And then you throw seaweed on top, maybe some birds landing on it, maybe even some barnacles. And suddenly, it feels quite solid.
Until it isn't.
Exactly. And the second possibility is giant sea turtles, which also makes a lot of sense. So leatherback turtles, for example, can reach enormous sizes. And early travelers described turtle backs that look like land, especially if, visibility was poor.
So again, you can see how these might be based on real phenomena, but they're filtered through kind of fear and limited knowledge.
Yeah, exactly. So, what's fascinating here is that medieval writers didn't treat the Aspidochelone as random. They gave it meaning. So in Christian moral texts, the Aspidochelone becomes a metaphor for the devil. Looks safe, offers rest, but if you trust it, it destroys you. And in that sense, it's doing double duty. It's, as you mentioned, a very practical sailor's warning, but also a theological lesson, not just beware of the sea, but also beware of false security.
Yeah, definitely. And that's kind of why it appears so often in bestiaries alongside real animals. Medieval readers didn't sharply separate biology from symbolism. a creature could be physically real and morally instructive at the same time.
And it's also interesting, isn't it, that this idea extended not only as an island, but it's seen as a myth in multiple cultures, that the entire world is supported on the back of a giant turtle. So unlike the Blemmyes or the Cynocephali, this isn't about other people, it's about the environment itself. It's about a world that doesn't care whether you understand it or not.
So far, our creatures have lived far away, but the Catoblepas is different because this creature doesn't live somewhere exotic. It lives somewhere nearby.
Yeah, which already makes it a lot worse.
Yeah, much worse. So the Catoblepas is described by ancient writers, most famously Pliny the Elder. He has a lot to answer for with these.
He does.
It's described as a large, heavy animal, something like a buffalo or a wildebeest. It has a thick body, short legs, and a head so massive that it constantly droops downward. So heavy that the creature can barely even lift it.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds almost... It sounds a bit frightening, but also a bit pitiful. Like it can't even lift its own head up.
Yeah, it does. It does on the face of it until you hear what happens if it does lift its head. Because anyone who meets the Catoblepas gaze dies instantly.
Yes, exactly. So there's no attack, there's no bite, they're just dead.
Yes, exactly. No wounds, no struggle. The Catoblepas doesn't chase people. It just exists in a place that you shouldn't be. And if you wander too close, then you die.
So another good way of keeping people out of unwanted places then, right? So where is this Catoblepas meant to live?
Well, it was almost always in swamps, marshes, low-lying wetlands, places associated with decay, rotting vegetation, dead animals, stagnant water, all of that sort of stuff. So Pliny places it in parts of Africa, but most importantly, he associates it with kind of like a landscape, not geography.
Right.
So the Catoblepas belongs to environments that just feel wrong, places where the air is heavy and where animals might die suddenly and humans might fall ill without warning.
Yeah, so another environmental monster, but this one a bit subtler than the Aspidochelone. You know, the sea kind of kills you dramatically, but the Catoblepas kind of kills you quietly. And I think that makes it way more unsettling. Actually, in many ancient accounts, people don't even realize like what's happened to them. Someone enters the marsh, hours later, they're just found dead, no injury. As we said, there's no sign of violence. So the explanation becomes that there's a creature out there whose presence, who just the fact of them existing is lethal. So you've described its looks, but is there any reference to like a living, like a real animal that we can make a comparison between so we can explain how these really looked?
Well, it's quite tricky because each depiction looks vastly different. So one image might be of a giant upright elephant, 3 times the size of a normal human, with like a big flabby belly and human fists. But another might be more like muscular and lean and walking on all fours with curved horns and sharp teeth and tusks. And there's others that might be more kind of cute, basically a vicious puppy. And then there's some as though it's kind of like a cow-like creature.
Yeah, there's some really great pictures. If you ever want to search the Catoblepas, you will not find 2 of the same image, which I find really fascinating. But why is it thought that this particular creature was a sign of instant death then? Like, what's actually going on?
Well, I think there's a few candidates for this, but probably one of the clearest is that it's a sign, like you mentioned before, of kind of there being some cause of death in that area. So let's start with toxic gases. In swamps and marshes, they can release gases like methane, hydrogen sulfide, and carbon dioxide. And in certain conditions, these gases can kind of just displace oxygen and kill you very quickly. So to someone without the chemistry or atmospheric science, it can feel like death came from nowhere.
Yeah, and then if someone went looking for you, they might die too as a consequence of those toxic gases, which sort of reinforces the idea that something in that specific place is deadly, right?
Yeah, and there's another explanation that sort of comes off of this, which could just be disease. You know, marshes have long been associated with illnesses like malaria, long before anyone knew what caused them.
What about the whole thought that they kill just by looking at you?
Yeah, this is a bit like, is it Medusa, maybe?
Yeah.
So that's where symbolism and misunderstanding kind of collide. So if people believe that merely seeing the Catoblepas caused death, what they're really saying is being there at all is enough to kill you. This is pre-scientific thinking grappling with kind of invisible threats. The Catoblepas is what you invent when danger has no obvious source. And like the Aspidochelone, it isn't just biology, but it's also moral. Many medieval writers treat the Catoblepas as like a warning against forbidden places, against wandering into lands that is stagnant, corrupt, or cursed.
So from dragons to vampires to unicorns, there are many mythical creatures that still inspire the stories that we tell. But there are few that remain as true possibilities, you know, creatures with question marks over their existence, living somewhere out there in the world, you know, like Bigfoot, the Chupacabra, or Nessie. These cryptids, as they're known, they're exciting fantasies that most of us don't actually believe in. They're myths, they're legends that we sort of keep as part of our culture out of choice. Some people do believe in them, but most of us don't, and we don't keep them in our minds because we fear them. We want them there. But before these came about, ancient legends, it seems, were very different.
Yeah. For much of human history, humans didn't invent mythical creatures for fun. They were often describing something real that they couldn't quite explain any other way. In an unexplored world, one where it would be rare or even impossible to see far beyond your own birthplace, stories would travel home from faraway lands and they would sound fantastical.
Right. And I mean, have you ever seen the way that medieval artists painted or depicted animals? So more often than not, when they heard about an animal, they were relying purely on the description of someone who saw it, because obviously they didn't have cameras back then. So they end up looking kind of wonky. So if you take an elephant, for example, so an artist's interpretation back then may have been based purely on the description of a traveler. You know, they might say something like, oh, it's like a horse, but bigger, with a long nose. And then they get this monstrosity that we're looking at right now.
Yes. So to describe it for listeners, we have basically almost like a dog-like creature with a trunk that looks like a trumpet.
Yeah.
And the feet look like paws, like a dog. So it does look like a cryptid, yeah.
Yeah, it very, very much looks cryptid-like, doesn't it? And it just goes to show how much of the world was yet unknown only just a few hundred years ago, really. But as exploration expanded and documentation improved, these just sort of disappeared. So you can see why these legends spread as though they were fact and people just believed them. But, you know, now it's a bit harder to get away with in the modern age. We have cameras, we've explored much of the world, and with that, these sorts of legends died. I mean, I know people still take pictures of Bigfoot, but they're always suspiciously blurry considering we have such amazing cameras on our phones these days. But anyway, I am, for one, excited to see what happens when we finally explore the deep ocean properly. Because we mentioned the Aspidochelone and the fact that the sea is treacherous and we don't know much about it. Actually, we still don't know much about the ocean. Mm-hmm. The deep ocean is 99% unexplored. And there's an engineering company called Deep that's doing something really fascinating, creating these undersea habitats, which look a little bit like the Gungan world in Star Wars. And their goal is to make humans aquatic. So it might not be that distant into the future that we can find new species of creatures that we could have never imagined. right now with the deep sea, we're kind of in the same position as medieval people, right? In terms of being able to explain what was there. Maybe one day we will dig up a mermaid.
Well, if you look at the sea, especially the deep sea, a lot of the creatures and a lot of the plants look like alien worlds.
Yeah,
Looks
they do.
like how we describe or create alien worlds in media. So it will be amazing to see more of, and it'll be amazing if we ever do find those mermaids. But to that end, there are still creatures that people believed in, even after mapping the world to explain things like death, fear, and misfortune. And we'll be exploring those in our next episode. And this is What We Did Before. I'm Matt.
And I'm Ollie, and if you've got an idea for another episode, we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below, and we'll be sure to credit you in the outro of that episode if we choose your idea.
And please do subscribe if you enjoyed the episode. It really does help us out massively. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
See you next time.